Okay, so today for you guys, I have books that did things different. And these are just books that they don't follow the traditional sort of way of writing. They try to push the boundaries and they try to do things that you haven't seen in other ways. And this is such an interesting concept to me because like I feel like I've read so many books that like most of the time I'm bored, most of the time I've seen it before, but when you can use the format of writing in a unforeseen way, that's really where you can get a whole different angle of sort of thinking, and that's really what I find most fun. The thing that I love about reading, the thing that really I find enjoyment from reading is thinking in different ways, thinking in different perspectives, and seeing things in a different way. And sometimes it takes a different format. Sometimes it takes a different way of doing things in order to discover that. So the first thing we have is Ficciones, or fictions, depending on the version you get, by Jorge Luis Borges. And I know for a very long time I was saying that wrong, but I think I'm finally saying it right. Hopefully. I probably still saying it wrong, but Borges is interesting because he writes about stories that the easiest way to describe Borges is he writes about things that are impossible to think about. And this is not in this book, but he writes about a single-sided coin or a dot that contains absolutely everything all at the same time. And those sorts of concepts. And it's really meant to push the boundaries of your imagination. It's really meant to push the boundaries of your thought and kind of explain reality as some sort of a dream, as some sort of thing beyond understanding, and kind of encapsulate human imagination, encapsulate the whole human experience into these ideas. There's a bunch of really good stories in this book. No two are kind of the same. There's some that are somewhat narrative based, and there's some that are just completely a story that just uses allegory to kind of prove a point. And I really enjoy that because there's sentimental stories, and then there's stories that are pure just philosophical metaphors that are meant to dazzle the imagination. My favorite from this is probably Tilan Ukbar Orbis Tertius, which is the first story of this, and a lot of people say this is the best thing he ever wrote. It's essentially this guy is trying to track down a information about this lost society, and this society operated at a different level of consciousness, at a different level of thought, and they were able to create things through the pure use of their imagination. It's an interesting kind of Lovecraftian way of setting up a story where he's tracking down things through lost journals, lost articles, and sort of things like that. But yeah, I really had a lot of fun reading this, and I think you will as well. Another story I liked from this is obviously The Garden of Forking Pass, which is another very famous one from this, The Library of Babel, and I think there was another one I really loved. Theme of the Traitor and Hero, I think is what it was. Those are my favorite stories in this, but again, I need to go back and reread this just because it's such a good book and because there's so much in it. But with that said, we'll get into the next thing because I don't want to go too long about Borges, because I will just stay talking about him the rest of the day, because he's one of those writers that wrote so many different aspects, so many different things, so many different styles, that you can read Borges and get a whole different experience from him by just simply reading another thing that he wrote and another style that he wrote. This is The Place of the Lion by Charles Williams. It's a very interesting book, and the reason I found this book was because I found out C.S. Lewis was very much inspired by this guy and this guy's style of writing, and the Space Trilogy has slowly become one of my favorite series. I think by the time I finish the third book, I've read the first two. When I finish the third book, I think it's going to be my favorite series. I think it's going to edge out Dune just because of the experimental nature of it, the kind of fun aspect to it, the less kind of doom and gloom to it. Like I very much enjoy the sort of wait to Dune and the cycle of things, but there's no real resolution, and in terms of a story, it kind of takes away from the story if there's no resolution. Again, you could take it or leave it, that kind of perspective, but that's just my take on things. But anyway, The Place of the Lion is a story about basically this English village where these archetypes of, I think it's Platonic archetypes, start to come into fruition, start to come into reality, and the everyday people are kind of faced with these larger than life creatures. You know, there's a giant lion, there is a giant butterfly, there's a pterodactyl, there's all sorts of things, there's a giant snake, and all these people are forced to confront the forces of nature and either fall victim to their greatest fears or face them and overcome them. And it's a really interesting sort of story about kind of exploring humanity and kind of how people rise to the occasion or some people fall. And there's a very interesting sort of Genesis kind of theme to the ending of it. And you know, all this happens because there was a wizard who opened a portal and forgot to close it. I mean, that's the similar story to why we see the Loch Ness Monster. Supposedly, Aleister Crowley opened a portal on Lake Loch Ness and forgot to close it and left the ritual open, and that's why people spot that's to me is my favorite, one of my favorite stories about all sorts of stuff like that. But it's just it's fun to see all these different things come together into such a meaningful work and such an interesting work. The one thing I would say about this is it's difficult to read. It's a very short book. I think it's around, it is less than 200 pages, but you're not going to be able to fly through it just because of the references, just because of what it's trying to say. And it's something you're going to have to think about. And I really love it. And I really love Charles Williams, and I'm going to have to go read more of him. But that leads us into the last thing, which is Tertium Organum. And this is by P. Uspensky. I'm actually reading another book by Uspensky right now, which is The Strange Life of Ivan Osakin. I don't know how to say it, but I'm really enjoying this book, and I kind of was just thinking about Uspensky, and I was thinking about how Tertium Organum really does relate to a lot of the stuff Borges writes, and how it kind of relates to how Borges tries to describe reality, the nature of reality, and the nature of things. And if you haven't read Tertium Organum, this is a book that's kind of hard to describe, but it's speaking to the nature of consciousness, speaking to the nature of things. It's speaking to the tying between the fourth dimension and the aspect of time, and how we can kind of take a somewhat metaphysical sort of experience and tie it to the works of Plato or the works of Immanuel Kant, and how there is a real tie over between these two philosophies, and how if we could grasp these two things at once, we could come to a much better understanding. And it's interesting for the fact that Uspensky is somebody that really understands philosophy. I just don't care enough to understand it, but he's taking the perspectives of various different people that believe the world was exactly what they saw versus people that believe that there was more to what was seen and what we could ever observe, and how to kind of combine these two ideas, how to kind of progress us into the next sort of phase of thinking. And the most interesting aspect of this book is that Uspensky is probably most well known for summarizing Gurdjieff's teachings and putting it out to the world. And upon meeting Gurdjieff for the first time, Gurdjieff says, if you don't know Gurdjieff, just look him up. Very interesting character. I think character is the best way to describe him, just because everyone that met Gurdjieff had a different opinion of him, and he really did kind of play up that trickster sort of archetype and just messing with people. And it's just, that's really the most funny aspect about him, is that he just was constantly messing with people, constantly testing people. And there's a very funny story in Search of the Miraculous where this guy is coming to Gurdjieff thinking Gurdjieff's this great master, and Gurdjieff convinces this so-called great occultist that Gurdjieff is really just a traveling salesman that tricked everyone, and that he doesn't really have any sort of abilities or any sort of intelligence. He's just a hack. And then the guy leaves, and he never sees him again. But anyway, on the first meeting, Gurdjieff says to Uspensky, if you knew what you wrote in this book, Tertium Organum, then I would bow down and call you master. But because you don't, you still have much to learn. And that was a really interesting way to frame it. And that's really one of the main reasons why Uspensky then became a student of Gurdjieff, because this was he was taken so aback by this phrasing. But this really is a very interesting book. And it kind of explains the fourth dimension better than I've ever seen it explained. It was something I always kind of intuitively thought, that time and space were the fourth dimension, and if you could see things in that sort of frame of mind, then all things would exist at once. Think of that scene in Interstellar where, sorry to spoil it, it's like 20 years old, but everything is happening at the same time. All time is at the same point, and he's able to sort of affect time, if you know what I'm talking about. I'm trying to leave it as vague as possible, but it's Ouspensky has a really good analogy. Is that if you have if you take a tree and you trace all of the leaves of the tree across a sheet of paper, then you can't see the connection. But if you see the full picture, then you see that they're all connected to the same root. And that's really how Ouspensky was describing the fourth dimension and the idea of space and the idea of time, and how these ideas are tied together and how they're just kind of all happening at the same time. It's a very fascinating idea to think about, and then to have him tie this into a metaphysical discussion with a physical discussion and kind of try to push forward a sort of new way of looking at the world. And if we could look at the world in this new way, then we could understand it in a new way and move forward for the betterment of us all. It's a very interesting book. It's very difficult to describe. It's one of those things that you're going to just have to read. It says a whole lot of interesting things in there, and yeah, I had a lot of fun reading it. But with that said, these were 3 books that did something different, that tried to push the boundaries, that tried to do things in a different manner. And maybe you don't enjoy them just for the fact that they did things different, but whenever somebody can try something and succeed with creating something new, I always find some sort of enjoyment in it. So yeah, let me know books that were very unique, books that did things in a interesting manner, that kind of pushed the boundaries of what you thought fiction or nonfiction could be, that tied together seemingly ideas that didn't make sense in grouped together, but for some reason the author was able to tie them together and it just clicked. Something like that. But with that said, I love you guys so much. Thank you guys so much. Peace out. I'll catch you in the next one.